Hello, friends. Today we're going to explore another topic that's near and dear to my heart as a comic book artist, and something that I feel really distinguishes the great art from the 80s and 90s from what's currently on the shelves, and that is the topic of heroic proportions. To do it, we're going to look at some classic comics and also return to the comic artist standby, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. Before we get started, though, please check me out online at scottgross.works and scottgross.works on Instagram, and look for my independent comic, Cathair Apocalypse, at cathairapocalypse.com. Apologies for the laggy camera. Today, we're going to look again at How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which had such an influence on me as a kid, and which should really be on every one of your shelves as comic book artists. The section in particular that we're going to look at, I think, introduced the nomenclature of heroic proportions into the comic artist's vocabulary. And I'm going to read directly from the book. Let's start with the average Joe like you or me. Most average guys are about 6.5 heads tall, but take a look at this sketch of Reed Richards. Notice that he is 8 3/4 heads tall. If we draw a hero, he's got to look like a hero. He should have heroic proportions. Unfortunately, the normal 6.5 head tall proportions would make him seem somewhat dumpy when drawn in a Marvel mag. The concept here is that all of your characters in a comic book, and I would argue that this holds true even for non-super characters, have to be more interesting than people you would meet in real life. Otherwise, why would you be interested in the story? So, something about their character design has to be superhuman, even if they don't have superhuman abilities. And this is the principle that underlies heroic proportions, whether you're talking about men, women, or bad guys, as we'll see. Note that the superhero is larger, the book says, with broader shoulders, more muscular arms and legs, a heavier chest, and an even more impressive stance. There's nothing weak about the fella next to Captain America, but a superhero simply has to look more impressive, more dramatic, more imposing than the average guy. This page in particular is something that we're going to return to at the end of the video. On this page, we presented 2 shots of the dramatically demonical Dr. Doom, Stan Lee writes. But the main idea is that the bottom pose is more dramatic. The legs are spread wider. The shot is more of an upshot, which makes us seem like we're beneath the character and that he's lording over us. We're getting more of the underside of the elbows and the triceps. This is a more menacing pose than the competently executed but less dramatic sketch on top. We're going to return to these concepts again in looking at some comics from the classic era of the 80s, starting with a issue that really blew my mind when it came out, Secret Wars number 10, which is penciled by Mike Zeck. One of the great things about the Secret Wars 12-issue miniseries is that many of the pages featured all of the characters together, and you had a chance to compare the different proportions of the Hulk to, Hawkeye, for instance. But the panel I want to look at in particular is very mundane and underscores why, when we're looking at old comics, it's always good to look not necessarily at the cover, not necessarily at the splash page or the dramatic action, but at some of the very simple panels where the comic book artist is just plying his craft in putting 2 characters, or 3, in this case 3 characters together in a dramatic way. Notice how Captain America is presented just the way he is in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. He is dramatic. His legs are spread in a powerful way. He's facing off against the hunched over, more craven Wolverine, with Magneto adjudicating in the background. But if we count proportions, he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 heads high. And clearly the leader in this trio. If we keep going on the book, at the end, Captain America leads the heroes against Dr. Doom, and here he again is striking a very dramatic pose with his legs spread wide. There he is. Again, apologies for the lag here. His legs are spread wide. There's not as much attention to anatomy as to making his legs seem tree trunk-like, and his pose seem dramatic. He's defying Dr. Doom, who in this issue now has the power of the Beyonder. I tried recreating this pose, and in doing so, I was able to study the gesture and also the approach to proportions, and I think that my rendering, even though, again, the anatomy is way off, conveys the original pose. All right, let's keep going and look at another comic from around the same time period. This is Wonder Man, a character with no real interest or reason for being. But this particular cover I always felt was very striking because it presents the hero both as being dwarfed by the villain, the Dreadnought, but also as being very massive. Note his proportions. They are clearly heroic proportions. He is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and change heads high, but he is at the same time overwhelmed by the figure above him. This is a very challenging thing to do in comics and in illustration. You want to make your hero appear grand and larger than life, and yet in order for him to have any kind of a hero's journey, he has to face obstacles that are even mightier and greater than him. So on the same page, you have to balance those two forces. And in this case, we see how it's done. In my recreation, I even threw Wonder Man into shadow to make his silhouette stand out, and then also maybe make the Dreadnought appear even more heavy. In a real drawing, I might white out the teeth there in the middle of his face and just leave that part white. Here's an amazing drawing of the Hulk by John Byrne. Notice again that it's not about anatomy, it's about proportions. The hands and the feet are much, much larger than the head. And yet, even within the head, if we just zoom in here, within that smaller space of the head, the skull and the cranium are very massive, and the teeth are very massive, and the nose is small. I guess this drawing gives us the theory of heroic proportions, that you make the big things bigger, and you make the small things smaller, and then that goes even within the things themselves when designing their interior features. This is one of the great comic books of my youth. I really believe that it's one of the greatest single issues ever drawn by John Buscema, the same guy who drew How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And in it, the Silver Surfer travels to a distant world, and squares off against a tribe of ogres that give him a beating. And the intention is to contrast the massive Neanderthal-like ogres with the lithe sexual athleticism of the surfer. And I feel that it's really a case study in proportions and in character design when we contrast the two. They give the Silver Surfer a beating, and we get sympathy for him in the story as a result of it. Notice the massive hands and the massive frontal lobes and tiny top of heads and big mandibles, plate, I don't know what this is called, mouth part. These proportions are made to seem goonish and grotesque, and at the same time powerful and menacing as they pound on the surfer. I feel like this panel really says it all. One of them is chewing on the surfboard, and then the other one has the Silver Surfer in his hands, and we see these massive hands and huge feet and tiny head, and the surfer by comparison in size. Ultimately, the Silver Surfer squares off against the main bad guy, the boss, whose name is the Overlord. And the character design here is, again, brilliant. When we're introduced to the character, we are at his feet. He's in his throne, and we are confronted by his massive feet and shins and armored knees. And the character in front of us is saluting him. This is a case study in those proportions where the big things, his hands, his knuckles, are exaggeratedly big. And towards the end, we get a nice chance to study the actual drawing, because this is an example of a drawing that's not fully rendered. We get a chance to kind of look at what he's trying to do there. So I copied it. And like I always do when I copy a drawing, I tried pushing the pose a little bit and pushing the proportions a little bit. And in my example, I had it up to 11 heads. And I still think that it looks good. It holds together. It's dramatic. In the original drawing, it's probably 9 or 10 heads, 9.5 heads. When you're doing your own drawings, try to push the pose and accentuate and experiment and see what difference it makes. Next, I want to look at a character named Terrax that appears throughout the Marvel history in many different guises. And in this John Byrne comic, he's introduced to us in the way that I think cosmic bad guys should be introduced. First of all, he's flying through space on an asteroid, and when we meet him, he is presented in a way that I feel embodies the rules that How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way taught us. His legs are bestride a flying asteroid. He's hewn from granite. His arms are massive. His hands hang low. His hands are huge. He's got a war club with a huge blade on it and a thick handle. And his forehead is cast in shadow. This guy ends up giving the Fantastic Four a hell of a trouncing. We see him smashing the Thing through the Baxter building, wielding his massive club. Here, his costume is simple, but in casting the rib cage there into shadow, we are given the feeling that he's inhaling as he proclaims, "Let the power flow from me, let the will of Terax be felt," and wields a massive war axe whose blade is so big that it doesn't even fit on the page. And that is repeated again here, where the axe blade is cast in silhouette, and it's just huge and sharp. And look at how big his tricep is, even bigger than his thigh, because that's how big it has to be to wield such an axe. The reason why I'm giving this particular comic such attention is because Terax appears in a current run of Superior Spider-Man from Marvel Comics. I'm going to point out some differences between the way that penciler Mike Hawthorne treats the character from the way John Byrne did. And I don't mean to bash Hawthorne. In fact, I follow him on Instagram and I really enjoy his work. Many of the choices that he's making may result from not really receiving very much editorial direction and having to work on a very tight deadline. But it's more instructive to look at a top-notch master craftsman like Mike Hawthorne and critique what things about his work we might do differently than to look at someone who's just learning to draw and has many, many things to improve upon. In the case of this work, every choice that the artist is making is deliberate and therefore open to review. So in light of what we just saw, I'd like to take a look at the way that Terax is being presented in today's comics. When we meet him, he's not flying in on an asteroid. In fact, he has just flipped the car over of a middle-aged gay couple in San Francisco. They tell us that they're gay, that's why I'm mentioning it. In fact, it's the major premise here of the page and why the aggrieved party pounds Terax on the chest in anger. Notice that the costume, though, doesn't convey the same dominating sense of power as we saw in John Byrne's work. The chest part is divided into 3 roughly equivalent sections, and there's a sense more that we're not looking at a galactic being, we're looking at kind of a bully from the gym here. Even when he's casting his arms about in a dramatic pose, there's something lacking about the proportions here. It's not just that Terax has fingernails, it's that the hand doesn't have the same power that it has here when he's smashing Hulk down through the Baxter building. Hawthorne's work is anatomically excellent. He's a master draftsman. But what he's doing stylistically doesn't convey the same power and awe as the way Terax was presented earlier. And I think nowhere is that more clear than in the way that the battle axe is presented. Look at it just from proportions. It's a much simpler shape than understanding the entire anatomy. Look at the length and thinness of the stalk and the relatively modest size of the blade. And then compare that to this size of the stalk, of the handle and the blade. It's just such a much more impressive weapon when it's in the hands of John Byrne than the way that it's currently being rendered. And I thought maybe I could give a try of just breaking it down, even just in the most simple example of just trying to look at the head. This is the original head. If you look at the way that it's presented in John Byrne's comic, his head is wide. He's got a wide jaw. He's got a wide smile, and it's wide like his shoulders. It's wide like his hands. But in the current way that he's being rendered, and this is taken from Hawthorne's Instagram, where he shows some of the sketches, it's much more anatomically correct. It's a much narrower, straight up and down head. He's definitely an angry being, but it doesn't have that I don't exactly know how to portray it, challenging aspect where I'm wide, I'm here, I'm in charge. It's more of a mushroom head. And again, I don't mean this to slam the current character design, but it shows the way in which a subtle difference in shape and proportion can make a big difference in the drama and the way that the character is presented. I want to say, by way of plugging the comic, that I also picked up Superior Spider-Man #3 at the comic book shop, and I'll be using it later on in a future video when we talk about fight scenes, how to stage them, and I really feel like the character design for Terrax improves as these issues go on. Thank you, everybody, for supporting me in these videos. Please, in the comments section, tell me about the comics that influenced you as a kid and the ones you want to see me cover. And, get in touch with me on Instagram, and happy drawing.